Hey everyone, tonight we venture into the shadows of a conflict that scarred a generation and left wounds that still bleed decades later. We're pulling back the curtain on the Vietnam War, but not the sanitized version you learned in history class. Tonight, we dig into the classified files, the buried reports, and the testimonies that powerful people never wanted you to hear. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to uncover the truth with me. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what you think you know about Vietnam. Now dim the lights, grab something warm to drink, and prepare yourself for a journey into deception, betrayal, and the machinery of war that chewed up everything in its path. Picture this. It's 1964, and President Lyndon Johnson stands before Congress, his voice heavy with righteous anger, describing an unprovoked attack on American ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. The story is simple, clean, and absolutely perfect for justifying war, except it never happened the way they told you. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the spark that ignited America's full-scale involvement in Vietnam, was built on lies so carefully constructed that it took decades for the truth to surface. But that's just the beginning of this story. You see, the real Vietnam War didn't start in 1964 with those phantom torpedo boats. It didn't even start in the 1960s. The roots of America's longest war stretch back to decisions made in smoke-filled rooms during World War II, when men in suits carved up the world like a Thanksgiving turkey, never imagining the blood that would flow from their choices. French colonial officials whispered promises to American intelligence officers. OSS agents shook hands with Ho Chi Minh himself, not knowing they were greeting their future enemy. The seeds of disaster were planted long before the first American combat troops ever set foot on Vietnamese soil. The Pentagon Papers, those explosive documents that Daniel Ellsberg leaked in 1971, revealed a stunning truth. 4 consecutive American presidents had lied to the public about Vietnam. Not small lies, not political spin, but massive systematic deceptions that sent 58,000 Americans to their deaths. The papers showed that officials knew the war was unwinnable as early as 1965, yet they kept feeding young men into the meat grinder while telling their families that victory was just around the corner. But even the Pentagon Papers only scratched the surface of the deception. Deep in the classified archives, documents have surfaced that paint an even darker picture. Operation Rolling Thunder, the massive bombing campaign that was supposed to break North Vietnam's will, was based on fundamentally flawed assumptions. Military analysts knew the bombing was ineffective, yet it continued for 3 years, dropping more ordnance on a country the size of New Mexico than was used in all of World War II. The real reason the bombing continued had nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with political face-saving and corporate profits. Consider the financial web that surrounded Vietnam. Defense contractors saw their stock prices soar as the war escalated. Companies like Bell Helicopter, Dow Chemical, and Boeing made billions while young Americans died in rice paddies. Internal memos from these corporations, released decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests, show executives celebrating contract extensions and lobbying for expanded military operations. One particularly chilling document from a Dow Chemical Board meeting discusses napalm production quotas with the casual tone of men planning a quarterly sales meeting. The chemical warfare conducted in Vietnam represents one of the war's most horrific secrets. Agent Orange wasn't just a defoliant, as the military claimed. It was a weapon of mass destruction used against both enemy forces and civilian populations. Military scientists knew the long-term health effects would be catastrophic, yet they sprayed over 20 million gallons of the stuff across South Vietnam. Internal Army reports from 1967 warned of cancer risks and birth defects, but these warnings were classified and buried. Vietnamese children are still being born with horrific deformities today, 50 years later, because of chemicals American planes dumped from the sky. But Agent Orange was just one component of a larger program. Operation Ranch Hand employed a cocktail of chemical weapons with names like Agent Blue, Agent Pink, and Agent Purple. Each formula was designed to destroy different aspects of Vietnamese life. Agent Blue killed rice crops, creating famine among civilian populations. The strategy was simple and brutal. If you can't tell friend from foe, starve them all and let hunger sort them out. The psychological warfare programs represent another dark chapter that remains largely hidden from public view. The CIA's Phoenix program officially aimed to dismantle Viet Cong infrastructure in South Vietnam. In reality, it became a systematic assassination campaign that killed between 20 and 40,000 people, many of them innocent civilians whose only crime was living in the wrong village at the wrong time. Phoenix operatives used torture, murder, and terror tactics that would have made the Gestapo proud. The program's architect, William Colby, later admitted that the line between legitimate intelligence gathering and state-sponsored terrorism had been completely erased. Phoenix teams operated with near-total impunity, backed by unlimited funding and legal immunity. They established provincial interrogation centers that were essentially torture facilities, where suspected Viet Cong sympathizers were subjected to electric shock, waterboarding, and psychological manipulation. The techniques developed in these centers would later be exported to Latin America during the Reagan years and eventually find their way to Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. The cover-up extended to the highest levels of government. When reports of atrocities began surfacing, military commanders and Pentagon officials worked frantically to suppress evidence and silence witnesses. The My Lai massacre, where American troops murdered over 500 unarmed civilians, was covered up for over a year. Only the persistence of investigative journalist Seymour Hersh brought the story to light, and even then, the full extent of the atrocity was never revealed. My Lai wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of war crimes that stretched across the entire conflict. Military records show that similar massacres occurred in dozens of Vietnamese villages, but the cases were either never investigated or quickly buried by superior officers. The unofficial policy seemed to be that dead Vietnamese, regardless of their actual allegiance, could be counted as enemy casualties. This led to the infamous body count mentality, where success was measured not by territory gained or objectives achieved, but by the sheer number of corpses American forces could produce. The draft system itself was designed to ensure that the burden of fighting fell disproportionately on poor and minority communities. While college students received deferments and the sons of wealthy families found ways to avoid service, working class kids from inner cities and rural towns were shipped off to die in a war their government knew couldn't be won. The unfairness was so blatant that it sparked massive protests and helped fuel the civil rights movement as young black men realized they were being asked to fight for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. What makes this even more tragic is that many of the young men who fought in Vietnam were true believers. They trusted their government, believed in their mission, and thought they were defending democracy against communist tyranny. Instead, they found themselves in a nightmare scenario where the enemy was often indistinguishable from civilians, where their own allies were corrupt and unreliable, and where victory was measured in meaningless statistics that bore no relation to reality on the ground. The psychological toll on American troops was devastating. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though not yet recognized by that name, affected hundreds of thousands of veterans. Many turned to drugs to cope with the horror they witnessed and participated in. Heroin use among American troops reached epidemic proportions, with some estimates suggesting that over half of all enlisted men used illegal drugs regularly. The military response was typically harsh and counterproductive, focusing on punishment rather than treatment. Meanwhile, back home, the American public was being fed a steady diet of propaganda disguised as news. The military's public relations machine worked overtime to present the war in the most favorable light possible, often distorting or completely fabricating stories of heroism and progress. Television reports showed American troops distributing candy to Vietnamese children while conveniently omitting footage of the same villages being bombed into rubble hours later. The media's complicity in spreading government lies cannot be overstated. Major newspapers and television networks regularly published Pentagon press releases as fact without independent verification. Journalists who attempted to report the truth found themselves blacklisted, their credentials revoked, and their stories killed by editors who feared losing access to official sources. The relationship between the press and the military had become so cozy that the line between journalism and propaganda had effectively disappeared. This systematic deception created a credibility gap that would haunt American institutions for decades. When the truth about Vietnam finally began emerging in the 1970s, public trust in government collapsed. The phrase, "Don't trust anyone over 30, became a generational rallying cry, and cynicism about official pronouncements became the default position for millions of Americans. The Vietnam War didn't just cost lives and treasure, it fundamentally altered the relationship between the American people and their government. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Vietnam deception was how it betrayed the very people it claimed to protect. The South Vietnamese government that America propped up was a corrupt dictatorship that had no genuine popular support. American officials knew this from the beginning, yet they continued to pretend that they were defending democracy. Villages that welcomed American troops one day would be harboring Viet Cong fighters the next, not because the villagers were committed communists, but because they were trying to survive in an impossible situation. The corruption extended to every level of the South Vietnamese military and government. American aid money disappeared into Swiss bank accounts, while Vietnamese soldiers went without food and ammunition. Equipment that was supposed to defend South Vietnam ended up being sold to the enemy on the black market. Despite overwhelming evidence of this corruption, American officials continued to pour billions of dollars into a system they knew was rotten to its core, to its core. The intelligence agencies played their own deadly games within this larger theater of deception. The CIA's involvement in Vietnam extended far beyond simple intelligence gathering. They were running their own private army in Laos, conducting operations that were technically illegal under international law. Air America, the CIA's airline, flew weapons to anti-communist forces while smuggling opium on the return flights. This wasn't some rogue operation gone wrong. It was official policy, signed off on at the highest levels of the agency. Documents declassified in the 1990s reveal that the CIA was actively involved in the global heroin trade during the Vietnam era. They needed funding for operations that Congress would never approve, so they turned to drug money. The same agency that would later wage America's war on drugs was literally importing heroin into American cities to finance covert operations in Southeast Asia. The irony would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. Young American soldiers were dying from overdoses of drugs that their own government helped smuggle into the country. The Green Berets, America's elite special forces, were conducting assassination missions across the border in Cambodia and Laos, operations that violated international law and congressional oversight. These missions, codenamed Daniel Boone and later renamed Salem House, involved killing suspected enemy leaders and destroying supply lines in neutral countries. When some Green Berets tried to expose a particularly brutal assassination program, they were court-martialed and their cases classified to protect national security. The military was more concerned with covering up war crimes than preventing them. The technological warfare being tested in Vietnam reads like science fiction, except it was horrifyingly real. The military experimented with weather modification, attempting to extend the monsoon season through cloud seeding operations. Project Storm Fury aimed to flood enemy supply routes by making it rain more heavily and for longer periods. They were literally trying to weaponize the weather, turning nature itself into an instrument of war. When these programs were finally exposed in the 1970s, they led to international treaties banning weather warfare. Electronic surveillance reached levels that would make modern intelligence agencies jealous. The military deployed sensors throughout the Vietnamese jungle that could detect human movement, body heat, and even urine. The McNamara line, a high-tech barrier of electronic sensors and automated weapons, was supposed to stop infiltration from North Vietnam. It cost billions of dollars and accomplished virtually nothing, but it did provide valuable testing data for surveillance technologies that would later be used against American citizens. The psychological operations extended beyond the battlefield into American homes. The military conducted studies on how to manipulate public opinion through careful presentation of casualty figures and battle reports. They learned that Americans would tolerate higher casualties if they were presented gradually rather than in large, shocking numbers. This led to a deliberate policy of spreading bad news over time to minimize its psychological impact on the home front. Military psychiatrists studied the breaking points of American soldiers to determine how long troops could remain in combat before becoming ineffective. These studies revealed that most soldiers would begin to suffer psychological breakdown after approximately 200 days of combat. Yet the military continued to deploy troops for year-long tours. The research was used not to protect soldiers' mental health, but to calculate acceptable casualty rates and replacement schedules. The treatment of prisoners of war on both sides violated every principle of the Geneva Conventions. American interrogators used techniques that would later be classified as torture, while captured Americans endured years of brutal treatment in North Vietnamese prisons. Both governments used their prisoners as propaganda tools, parading them before cameras while denying them basic medical care and human dignity. The prisoner exchanges that did occur were carefully orchestrated media events designed to maximize political advantage rather than humanitarian benefit. The environmental destruction caused by the war was so extensive that large areas of Vietnam remain uninhabitable today. Beyond the chemical defoliants, the military used massive bulldozers to clear entire forests, creating free fire zones where anything that moved could be shot. Roam plows, enormous machines designed for construction work, were repurposed to scrape the Vietnamese countryside bare. Millions of acres of agricultural land were destroyed, creating refugee populations that fled to overcrowded cities where they lived in squalor. The Strategic Hamlets program forced rural Vietnamese into concentration camps disguised as protective villages. Families were torn from their ancestral lands and herded into barbed wire compounds where they could be more easily monitored and controlled. The program was presented to the American public as a humanitarian effort to protect civilians from communist terror. But in reality, it was a systematic campaign to destroy traditional Vietnamese village life and create a population dependent on American aid. Medical experiments were conducted on both American troops and Vietnamese civilians without their knowledge or consent. Soldiers were given experimental drugs to enhance their combat performance, while Vietnamese prisoners were used to test new interrogation chemicals and psychological manipulation techniques. The results of these experiments were classified, and the subjects were never informed of what had been done to them. Some veterans only learned decades later that their mysterious illnesses were caused by drugs their own military had secretly administered. The financial cost of the war was deliberately hidden from Congress and the American people. The Pentagon used creative accounting methods to spread war expenses across multiple budget categories, making it impossible to determine the true cost of the conflict. Money that was supposed to fund domestic programs was quietly diverted, to support military operations. The inflation that plagued the American economy in the 1970s was directly caused by the massive spending on Vietnam. But this connection was never acknowledged by government officials. Corporate profiteering reached obscene levels as companies charged the military inflated prices for basic supplies. A simple screwdriver that cost pennies to manufacture would be sold to the Pentagon for $20. Construction companies built military bases in Vietnam using substandard materials while charging premium prices, leading to structures that collapsed during monsoons and killed American servicemen. These same companies then received additional contracts to rebuild what they had originally constructed poorly. The refugee crisis created by the war was far worse than the public ever knew. Millions of Vietnamese fled their homes to escape the fighting, creating massive displacement camps where disease and malnutrition were rampant. American officials knew these camps were death traps, but they continued to herd civilians into them because it served military objectives. Children born in these camps grew up malnourished and traumatized, creating generational damage that persists today. The betrayal of America's allies was perhaps the most morally reprehensible aspect of the entire conflict. South Vietnamese officers who had worked closely with American forces were abandoned when the war ended, left to face execution or imprisonment by the conquering North Vietnamese army. Montagnard tribesmen who had fought alongside American special forces were left defenseless in the jungle when their American advisors suddenly departed. The message was clear. Loyalty to America was a one-way street that led nowhere good. The scope of betrayal extended beyond individual allies to entire ethnic groups who had thrown their lot in with the American cause. The Hmong people of Laos, recruited by the CIA to fight a secret war against communist forces, were promised protection and support that never materialized. When American forces withdrew, these mountain tribes were left to face genocidal retaliation from the Pathet Lao. Thousands were slaughtered, while survivors fled into the jungle where they starved or were hunted down like animals. The CIA officers who had recruited them simply vanished, their promises as ephemeral as morning mist. Intelligence reports from the period reveal that American officials knew exactly what fate awaited their indigenous allies, yet they made no effort to evacuate or protect them. Internal memos describe these groups as expendable assets, whose sacrifice was acceptable to maintain operational security. The cold calculation behind these decisions speaks to a moral bankruptcy that infected every level of the war effort. The drug epidemic that ravaged American cities during the 1970s and 1980s can be traced directly back to these covert operations in Southeast Asia. CIA-protected drug lords who had helped fund anti-communist forces didn't simply disappear when the war ended. They used their established networks and American connections to flood the United States with heroin and later cocaine. The same agency that had once praised these criminals as freedom fighters now turned a blind eye as they poisoned American communities. Congressional investigations in the 1980s uncovered evidence that some CIA operatives continued working with known drug traffickers long after the Vietnam War ended. These relationships, forged in the jungles of Laos and Cambodia, became the foundation for drug networks that would plague American cities for decades. When investigators tried to pursue these connections, they found their efforts blocked by claims of national security and executive privilege. The psychological warfare techniques perfected in Vietnam didn't stay in Southeast Asia either. The same specialists who had broken enemy prisoners began working for police departments across America, training interrogators and developing new methods of extracting confessions. The line between military intelligence and domestic law enforcement became increasingly blurred as Vietnam veterans brought their skills home to civilian agencies. COINTELPRO, the FBI's domestic surveillance program, employed tactics developed in Vietnam to monitor and disrupt anti-war protesters and civil rights activists. Agents who had learned to infiltrate and destroy enemy organizations in Southeast Asia turned these same techniques against American citizens who opposed government policies. The surveillance state that emerged during the Vietnam era never fully retreated, instead evolving into the massive intelligence apparatus that monitors Americans today. The medical cover-up surrounding Agent Orange exposure represent one of the most shameful chapters in the entire saga. Veterans returning from Vietnam began developing rare cancers and neurological disorders at alarming rates. Yet the Veterans Administration consistently denied any connection to chemical exposure. Internal documents show that VA officials knew about the health effects as early as 1978, but they actively suppressed research and denied benefits to sick veterans. Chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange possessed their own studies showing the deadly effects of dioxin exposure, yet they never shared this information with the military or the public. Corporate executives sat in board meetings discussing cancer rates and birth defects while calculating the legal costs of eventual lawsuits. To them, dead and dying veterans were simply line items on a balance sheet, acceptable losses in the pursuit of profit. The deliberate destruction of medical records became standard practice as evidence of chemical exposure mounted. Military personnel files that documented where soldiers served and what chemicals they encountered mysteriously disappeared from archives. Veterans seeking treatment found that their service records had been lost or destroyed, making it impossible to prove their exposure to toxic substances. This wasn't bureaucratic incompetence. It was systematic evidence destruction designed to limit government liability. Research conducted at veterans' hospitals during the 1980s revealed that children of Vietnam veterans were suffering birth defects and developmental disorders at rates far higher than the general population. These studies were quickly classified and their authors transferred to other positions. The pattern repeated itself. Whenever research threatened to expose the true scope of chemical damage, it was buried and the researchers silenced. The POW issue became a political football that obscured the real tragedy of American servicemen left behind in Southeast Asia. While politicians made speeches about bringing home missing soldiers, classified intelligence reports indicated that many POWs had been secretly transferred to the Soviet Union for interrogation and experimentation. These men became human guinea pigs in Soviet psychological and medical research programs, their existence denied by both American and Russian governments. Satellite imagery from the 1980s showed what appeared to be distress signals spelled out in prison camp gardens, suggesting that American prisoners were still alive and attempting to communicate. When this evidence was presented to government officials, it was dismissed as inconclusive or fabricated. Families of missing servicemen who demanded investigations found themselves harassed by government agents and their reputations destroyed by whisper campaigns. The economic manipulation surrounding the war extended far beyond defense contracts into currency speculation and international banking. Classified Treasury Department documents reveal that certain financial institutions were allowed to profit from advanced knowledge of military operations that would affect global commodity prices. Banks with connections to intelligence agencies made billions by betting against currencies in countries where American forces were about to intervene. The Federal Reserve's monetary policy during the Vietnam era was deliberately designed to hide the war's true cost from Congress and the American people. By creating inflation through money printing rather than raising taxes, the government essentially imposed a hidden tax on every American citizen. The poor and middle class bore the burden of financing the war through reduced purchasing power, while the wealthy profited from defense investments. International arms dealers connected to American intelligence agencies sold weapons to both sides of various conflicts, prolonging wars to maximize profits. The same companies that supplied the American military were secretly selling ammunition and equipment to communist forces through third-party intermediaries. This wasn't accidental. It was a calculated strategy to maintain profitable conflicts indefinitely. The refugee camps established in Thailand and other neighboring countries became laboratories for social control experiments. American researchers studied how to manage large, displaced populations, testing techniques for maintaining order and extracting information. These camps weren't humanitarian refuges. They were research facilities where desperate people became unwilling subjects in government studies. Children born in these camps were subjected to psychological testing and behavioral modification experiments without their parents' knowledge. American officials were particularly interested in studying how trauma affected cognitive development and how displaced populations could be molded for future political purposes. The data collected in these camps later informed domestic social programs designed to manage urban poverty. The environmental warfare conducted in Vietnam set precedents for ecological destruction that continue today. Military planners recognize that destroying an enemy's environment could be more effective than traditional bombing. This thinking influenced later conflicts where water supplies were targeted, crops destroyed, and entire ecosystems poisoned to achieve military objectives. The weather modification programs tested in Southeast Asia evolved into more sophisticated climate manipulation technologies that remain classified today. Government scientists learned that controlling precipitation patterns could create famines or floods in targeted regions, providing a weapon more devastating than nuclear bombs, but with plausible deniability. These capabilities were never abandoned. They were simply refined and hidden deeper in black budget programs. The sociological experiments conducted on American soldiers during the Vietnam era provided invaluable data for future military planning. Researchers studied how different personality types responded to combat stress, which backgrounds produced the most effective killers, and how unit cohesion could be maintained under extreme conditions. This research informed recruitment strategies and training programs that continue to shape American military doctrine. Military psychiatrists deliberately selected certain soldiers for exposure to particularly traumatic experiences to study the long-term effects of psychological trauma. These men became unwitting subjects in experiments designed to determine the breaking points of human consciousness. The resulting data was used not to prevent psychological damage, but to calibrate the acceptable levels of trauma that could be inflicted on enemy populations. The propaganda techniques developed during Vietnam became templates for managing public opinion in subsequent conflicts. Government specialists learned how to frame casualties as acceptable losses, how to distract attention from military failures, and how to manipulate patriotic sentiment to silence criticism. These methods were refined and deployed in every American military intervention that followed. Corporate media outlets became willing partners in this deception, accepting government talking points as factual reporting and marginalizing journalists who attempted independent investigation. The revolving door between government service and media careers ensured that former officials could shape news coverage from within major news organizations. Truth became a casualty, not just of war, but of a systematic campaign to control information. The classified documents that remain sealed to this day contain evidence of war crimes so extensive and systematic that their revelation would fundamentally alter public understanding of American foreign policy. These files document atrocities committed not just by individual soldiers in the heat of battle, but by senior officials who planned and authorized campaigns of terror against civilian populations. The true body count from the Vietnam War, including civilians killed by American forces, remains hidden in these classified archives. Conservative estimates suggest that over 2 million Vietnamese civilians died during the conflict, but the real number may be significantly higher. Military commanders routinely inflated enemy casualty figures while minimizing civilian deaths, creating statistical illusions that bore no relation to reality on the ground. Human experimentation conducted on prisoners and civilians during the war violated every principle of medical ethics and international law. American researchers tested biological weapons, mind-controlled drugs, and torture techniques on helpless subjects, then classified the results to prevent accountability. Some of these experiments continued for years after the war ended as researchers followed up on their human test subjects. The legacy of Vietnam continues to shape American foreign policy in ways that most citizens never recognize. The strategies of deception, the acceptance of civilian casualties, and the willingness to sacrifice allies for perceived strategic advantage all became standard operating procedures for subsequent interventions. Every American war since Vietnam has followed the same playbook of lies, cover-ups, and moral compromise. Yet, perhaps the most disturbing revelation is how completely this system of deception has been normalized. The institutions that orchestrated the Vietnam catastrophe were never dismantled or reformed. The same intelligence agencies, military commands, and corporate networks that created that nightmare continue to operate today with even greater power and less oversight. The lessons of Vietnam weren't learned, they were perfected. Learned, they were perfected. The institutional memory of these deceptions runs deeper than most Americans realize. When the Church Committee investigated intelligence abuses in the 1970s, they uncovered only the tip of the iceberg. For every document they declassified, dozens more were destroyed or hidden in compartmentalized programs that remain inaccessible today. The committee's final report, sanitized and edited by the very agencies it was meant to expose, revealed disturbing truths while concealing even more damaging secrets. The destruction of evidence became an art form, perfected during the Vietnam era. Military commanders learned to conduct operations with minimal paper trails, using verbal orders and off-the-books funding to maintain plausible deniability. When investigations threatened to expose uncomfortable truths, entire archives would mysteriously suffer fires, floods, or computer malfunctions that destroyed precisely the documents investigators needed most. The psychological operations specialists who cut their teeth in Vietnam went on to establish consulting firms that sold their expertise to corporations and foreign governments. These shadow companies operated in the gray areas between intelligence work and private business, conducting influence campaigns and disinformation operations for clients who paid well for their services. The techniques developed to break enemy morale were repackaged and sold to manage labor disputes, suppress environmental activism, and manipulate electoral outcomes. Training manuals from this era, obtained through leaked documents decades later, reveal the systematic nature of these psychological warfare programs. Specialists were taught to identify vulnerable populations, exploit existing social divisions, and create artificial crises that could justify authoritarian responses. The same playbook used to destabilize enemy societies was eventually turned inward against the American public. The financial networks established to fund covert operations in Southeast Asia evolved into permanent structures for off-the-books government activities. Banks in Switzerland, Panama, and the Caribbean became repositories for money that officially didn't exist, funding operations that Congress never authorized and the public never knew about. These financial channels remained active long after Vietnam, providing untraceable funding for interventions in Central America, Africa, and the Middle East. The drug money that initially funded anti-communist operations created addiction epidemics that transformed American cities. Neighborhoods that had been stable working-class communities became war zones as heroin flooded in through networks established during the Vietnam era. The social destruction was so extensive that entire generations were lost to addiction, incarceration, and violence. Yet the same officials who had facilitated this drug trade later appeared on television demanding harsh penalties for the addicts they had helped create. Corporate executives who profited from the Vietnam War used their windfall gains to purchase media outlets and establish think tanks that would shape public discourse for decades. These institutions became echo chambers where former military officials and intelligence operatives could present their perspectives as objective analysis. The revolving door between government service, corporate boards, and media positions ensured that dissenting voices were marginalized or excluded entirely. The medical experiments conducted on American servicemen extended far beyond exposure to chemical weapons. Military researchers tested experimental vaccines, mind-altering drugs, and sensory deprivation techniques on soldiers who believed they were receiving standard medical care. Many veterans developed mysterious illnesses that couldn't be traced to any known cause, suffering symptoms that matched the effects of classified experiments they never knew they had undergone. The cover-up of these medical experiments required the cooperation of major pharmaceutical companies, university research departments, and medical institutions across the country. Researchers who questioned unusual patterns of illness among veterans found their funding cut, their publications rejected, and their careers destroyed. The medical establishment that should have protected these men instead became complicit in concealing the evidence of their exploitation. Foreign governments that cooperated with American intelligence operations during Vietnam were rewarded with military aid, economic assistance, and protection from international scrutiny. Dictatorships that committed massive human rights violations were shielded from accountability as long as they remained useful to American interests. This pattern of supporting friendly tyrants while condemning unfriendly ones became a cornerstone of American foreign policy that continues today. The intelligence agencies developed new methods of population control that were tested in Vietnamese villages before being exported to allied governments around the world. Techniques for monitoring civilian communications, tracking individual movements, and identifying potential dissidents were refined in the laboratory of occupied Vietnam. These surveillance technologies found their way to Chile, Argentina, Indonesia, and dozens of other countries where they were used to crush democratic movements and maintain authoritarian rule. The environmental destruction caused by American military operations created long-term health crises that continue to affect Vietnamese families today. Children are still being born with birth defects caused by chemical exposure that occurred before their grandparents were born. The genetic damage from dioxin exposure has become embedded in the Vietnamese population, creating hereditary health problems that may persist for generations. American chemical companies that manufactured these weapons possessed detailed studies showing their long-term effects on human health and the environment. Corporate executives made calculated decisions to continue production while suppressing research that might have prevented widespread contamination. When lawsuits eventually emerged, these companies used their wealth and political connections to delay proceedings and minimize settlements. The Strategic Hamlet Program served as a model for population control operations that were later implemented in other conflict zones around the world. Military planners learned that controlling civilian populations was more important than defeating enemy forces, leading to strategies that prioritized surveillance and social control over traditional military objectives. These lessons influenced American involvement in conflicts from Central America to the Middle East. The propaganda techniques developed to manage American public opinion during Vietnam became standard tools for shaping democratic discourse. Government specialists learned to exploit existing social divisions, amplify extreme voices to discredit moderate opposition, and create false controversies to distract attention from substantive issues. These methods were later refined and deployed during subsequent conflicts to maintain public support for unpopular policies. The assassination programs conducted in Vietnam established precedents for targeted killing that fundamentally altered American military doctrine. The idea that individuals could be eliminated without due process or judicial oversight became normalized, laying the groundwork for the drone warfare programs that operate today. The legal frameworks developed to justify these killings during Vietnam continue to provide cover for extrajudicial executions around the world. Intelligence officers who participated in these assassination programs were later promoted to senior positions where they could implement similar strategies on a global scale. The institutional knowledge of how to conduct covert killing operations was preserved and transmitted through successive generations of intelligence professionals. What began as battlefield expedients in Vietnam evolved into systematic programs for eliminating perceived enemies worldwide. The corruption that characterized the South Vietnamese government was not an unfortunate side effect of the war, but a deliberate feature of American strategy. Military planners recognized that corrupt allies were more reliable than principled ones because their survival depended entirely on American support. This insight shaped future American relationships with authoritarian allies who could be controlled through their dependence on American aid and protection. The systematic torture conducted in Vietnamese interrogation centers provided valuable data for intelligence agencies seeking to refine their techniques. Researchers studied which methods produced reliable information, which ones caused permanent psychological damage, and which ones left no physical evidence. This research informed the development of torture protocols that were later used in other conflicts and eventually codified in training manuals for Allied intelligence services. The refugee crisis created by American military operations served as a testing ground for methods of managing large, displaced populations. Government researchers studied how to process, categorize, and control millions of people who had been driven from their homes. The techniques developed in Vietnamese refugee camps were later applied to manage immigration flows and displaced populations in other regions. The economic warfare conducted against North Vietnam established models for using financial pressure to destabilize enemy governments. Currency manipulation, trade embargoes, and banking restrictions became standard tools of American foreign policy that could be deployed without the political costs of military intervention. These economic weapons often proved more effective than conventional military force in achieving strategic objectives. The surveillance technologies tested in Vietnam evolved into the comprehensive monitoring systems that track global communications today. Intelligence agencies learned to intercept, analyze, and store vast amounts of information about both enemies and allies. The infrastructure developed to spy on Vietnamese communications became the foundation for surveillance networks that now monitor the entire planet. The psychological profiles developed on American soldiers during Vietnam provided invaluable data for recruitment, training, and deployment strategies in future conflicts. Military researchers identified personality types that were most susceptible to different forms of psychological manipulation, allowing commanders to tailor their approach to individual soldiers. This research informed the development of more sophisticated methods for maintaining unit cohesion and preventing psychological breakdown in combat situations. The truth about Vietnam isn't just history, it's prophecy. Every lie told, every cover-up orchestrated, every moral compromise accepted became a blueprint for the conflicts that followed. The machinery of deception that devoured Southeast Asia never stopped grinding. It simply found new theaters, new justifications, new populations to consume. Tonight, we've pulled back the curtain on a system of institutional betrayal so vast and systematic that it challenges everything Americans believe about their government and their country. The men who orchestrated this catastrophe weren't rogues or aberrations. They were the system itself, operating exactly as designed. And when the war ended, they didn't disappear. They were promoted, honored, and given even greater power to repeat their crimes. The saddest part isn't just the 58,000 names carved into black granite in Washington, or the millions of Vietnamese whose deaths were never counted, or the veterans still dying from chemicals their own government sprayed. The saddest part is how completely we've forgotten the lessons written in their blood, how easily we've accepted that this is simply how power operates in the shadows. But perhaps that's changing. Perhaps enough time has passed for us to finally confront what was done in our name. The documents are there, waiting to be read. The witnesses are still alive, ready to speak. The truth is patient. It waits in the archives, in the testimonies, in the shadows between the official stories. The question isn't whether these secrets will eventually surface. They always do. The question is whether we'll have the courage to look when they emerge from the darkness, blinking in the light of day. Because until we do, until we reckon with what Vietnam really was, we'll never understand what America really is. The ghosts of Southeast Asia are still with us. They whisper in every briefing room, every situation room, every place where men in suits decide the fate of people they'll never meet. They're asking the same question they've been asking for 50 years. When will you finally listen?